welcome. This is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and this is Exploration. Every week on Exploration, we discuss the fascinating world of science and its impact on society. And today, leading off, we're going to summarize some of the top stories of the past week, and we'll take some listener phone calls. And once again, it's impossible for me to answer all the emails that I get, but I'm going to try to group them into categories and try to answer them on air. Well, the lead story today concerns the budget, the Trump budget. It still has to, of course, go through the meat grinder of the United States Congress, but the initial take on the budget doesn't look very good at all. First of all, we're talking about massive cuts to the National Institutes of Health, cuts to the science budget of the United States, and also a zeroing out of many crucial funds for the arts. And some of that funding, in turn, goes to Pacifica Radio. So let's talk about that. And then let's answer some of the emails that I get. One persistent email I get is about Alzheimer's disease. It's the disease of the century, some people say, but why can't we cure it? I mean, what's the problem? And then, of course, there's all this hype around Mars. Even President Donald Trump has joined in on some of the excitement, saying that perhaps in his hypothetical second term, we may be able to have a manned mission to Mars. But there's some questions that have to be answered. First of all, who's going to pay for it? Is it really worth it? What's the return that we're going to get with a mission to Mars? And what would it take? What would it take to take this frozen desert called Mars and make it into another Garden of Eden? What would it take? And then let's say a few things about the movies. There's a new movie out there called Arrival, which got rave reviews, and it focused on the possibility of contact with alien civilizations, but there's a language problem. Is it possible that one day we'll be able to communicate with an alien species if they have a totally different grammar, totally different vocabulary and an attitude toward language? And how might an encounter with an intelligent species proceed? And then let's say a few things about making predictions for the year. Some people say, why do predictions fail? I mean, after all, futurists made a bunch of predictions. For example, flying cars, the paperless office. I mean, where's my flying car? What about the office? We have more paper. We're drowning in paper even in the middle of the cyber revolution. So we'll say a few things about why predictions fail. Well, let's just jump right into the top story of the past week. The top story today concerns the preliminary look at the Trump budget. And again, once it comes out of the United States Congress, it may look completely different. However, the initial peek at the budget does not look encouraging at all. We're talking about massive cuts to the EPA, the National Institutes of Health, arts. Many of the art programs that are familiar to our listeners get zeroed out. And then the question is it counterproductive? Because, of course, Donald Trump has said the two priorities of his campaign are, first, jobs, second, security. So are they in some sense counterproductive if they make massive cuts? For example, take a look at the NIH. We have to realize that sometimes science projects that have no immediate return can have enormous implications for the future. Take a look at the Human Genome Project. I remember decades ago when I was a grad student, the fact that just to sequence one gene took months because, of course, one gene could have tens of thousands of base pairs. And so it really consumed the work of an entire laboratory to sequence just one gene. And so the idea that we could sequence the entire genome was considered preposterous, a waste of money. The initial budget was $3 billion. Why? Because there are 3 billion base pairs in a DNA molecule. And eventually sequencing will go down to $1 per base pair. So that's where the number 3 billion came in. As it turned out, because of the computer revolution, because of the fact that we use robots to do the process of gene sequencing, We actually came in under budget ahead of time. This is one of the few times that in the history of the United States budget, scientists came in ahead of time and below budget. And boy, did that $3 billion open up whole new worlds for medicine. It'd be impossible, absolutely impossible, to conduct medical research today without the Human Genome Project. In fact, think about it. Back in those days before the Human Genome Project, we had no map. We had no guideposts. We were just babes in the forest. We didn't know what we were doing monkeying around with the genome. Now we have a map of life. And according to former President Barack Obama, it has generated billions of dollars in revenue. And, of course, opened up whole new territories for the investigation of diseases and other ailments. In fact, medicine today would be unimaginable without the Human Genome Project. So I'm building up to a point, and that is, if you cut the budget for science, you're basically going to be doing something that's counterproductive. You're going to be ruining the economy. You're going to be slowing down the progress of medicine. And you're going to be slowing down the generation of new jobs, because new jobs are generated by things like the Human Genome Project. Now, I can understand where this is coming from, because many politicians, to be frank, are former lawyers. And in law, everything is a zero-sum game. You sue Peter to pay Paul. Because what is law? Most of law is to protect personal rights and private property. But if somebody injures you or steals your property, you want to make sure that you have some retribution. So it's a zero-sum game. You rob Peter to pay Paul, basically. You tax Peter to pay Paul. So when a lawyer becomes a politician, at that point, it's all about budgets. It's all about taxation. You tax Peter to pay Paul. It's still a zero-sum game. And so politicians look at the budget as a pie. You slice the pie thinner and thinner and give a piece of the pie to one group or a piece of the pie to another group, depending upon who voted for you. Well, I'm a scientist. We don't look at the budget that way at all. You see, the budget is not a zero-sum game at all, because science generates wealth. Wealth creation ultimately comes from science. Now, of course, it's not quite that simple. We do know that labor, capital, investment, entrepreneurs, government programs, taxation, vision, yes, all of that contributes to wealth generation. But ultimately, wealth generation can be traced back to science, starting with the steam revolution. With the coming of the steam engine, the locomotive, and factories, the Industrial Revolution showed that science in its purest form, that is a science of thermodynamics, a science of heat, was responsible for the Industrial Revolution. The second wave, 80 years later, was the harnessing of electricity and magnetism, also done by physicists, and that opened up the electric age in the early 1900s. And then, later in the 1900s, we had the Information Revolution, with the coming of the transistor, the laser, high technology, the space program, all of it from the mind of a physicist. And so we see that wealth generation comes in waves because science comes in waves, because of steam power, because of electricity, because of high technology. We've had 3 waves of wealth generation. And it did not come from simply robbing Peter to pay Paul. No, it did not come from taxes. It came from innovation. It came from curiosity. And unfortunately, those could be very easily extinguished in a budget, which simply sees reality as a zero-sum game. Now, another thing. When the arts budget is cut, of course, we have any number of movie stars, well-known figures that can come to defense of the arts budget. But when it comes to the science budget, I mean, who's going to be arguing before Congress to say that we have to preserve our science budget? And you see that we are at a disadvantage here. We don't have the movie stars. We don't have the A-list celebrity figures that can argue for our budget. And that is a big problem. And now I'd like to answer some of the emails that I get. There's no way that I can answer all the emails. However, I'll try to group them into certain categories and try to address some of the questions that I get by email. One question I get by email is about health and medicine, specifically Alzheimer's disease. Many people think that Alzheimer's disease could be the disease of the century. With the aging of the baby boomers, we're going to see millions, literally tens of millions of people losing their memories, losing everything that makes us human. I know because my mother died of Alzheimer's disease, and it was tragic, absolutely tragic to see someone who had to endure so much hardship lose all their precious memories. My mother came over during the Depression. It was a hard time to be a laborer in California during the Depression. And then, of course, during the war, well, she was locked up in a concentration camp during the war. And after the war, there was racism. And, of course, she had to start a new life. Very difficult when the United States government had seized all your property and basically you were penniless after the war. And after enduring all these hardships, you lose your sense of who you are. At a certain point, my mother couldn't recognize me. In fact, she didn't even know who she was. Her memories robbed by Alzheimer's disease. Well, we don't really know what causes Alzheimer's disease today. However, we have indications. Some of it is genetic. For example, there's the APOE4 gene. And if you have a certain mutation, it predisposes you at a certain percentage rate to have Alzheimer's disease. And I once hosted a BBC series, a 4-hour series about time, where the whole question of losing your sense of time came up. And the question is, do you want to know? Do you want to know that you have the gene that predisposes you to have Alzheimer's disease? There's no cure, so what good is it going to do? And so BBC actually put a TV camera right in front of my face and asked me on tape, what would you do? Would you allow your genes to be sequenced, and would you want to know? Well, it turned out the BBC had sequenced my genes, and they knew the answer. And they asked me, before telling me the answer, do I want to know? And I said, yes, I want to know, even if there's no cure for Alzheimer's disease, because if you know that you are genetically predisposed to Alzheimer's disease, you can plan. You can make arrangements. You can meet with the family. You can make sure that the transition is as smooth as possible to reduce the amount of heartbreak and suffering involved with Alzheimer's disease. Well, it turned out that I did not have that gene defect in the APOE4 gene, which was a relief, but you're certainly not off the hook because it's all a matter of percentages. And so then the question is, well, what causes Alzheimer's disease? There are many theories. One of the leading theories is that it's an amyloid protein that gums up the brain. In an autopsy, you can see this gum that covers the cerebral cortex. Some people think that that's the origin of Alzheimer's. Other people say, no, it's a symptom. It's not really the cause of Alzheimer's at all, say some people. Well, to be quite frank, we're not sure. There's a debate going on in the scientific literature. However, there are some promising leads, unfortunately none of which have panned out. One of them is to create a vaccine that would attack the amyloid plaques, because these plaques actually happen all the time. But your body has the ability to sweep many of these plaques away until you enter old age, and then your body gradually loses the ability to remove these amyloid plaques. So that's one possibility. Yet another theory is the prion theory. Perhaps amyloid proteins reproduce themselves. You see, we once thought that diseases are generated by viruses and bacteria because they can reproduce themselves. Ordinary matter cannot reproduce itself, but viruses can and bacteria can. But now we know there's a third category of organic materials that can also reproduce themselves, and that is a prion. A prion is a protein molecule. It is out of shape. It is bent in the wrong way, so it doesn't perform like an ordinary protein. But when it touches, when it comes in contact with other normal proteins, it makes them misshapen as well. So starting with one misshapen protein, you have two, and then 3 and 4 and 5, and pretty soon you may have Alzheimer's disease. And so the amyloid protein, well, it is a protein. Many scientists believe that it's misshapen, and perhaps that's the way that it spreads. Well, I'll be very blunt. At the present time, there are certain chemicals that seem to slow down the progression of Alzheimer's, but there is no cure. Now, of course, on the Internet, you see all these self-help books saying that if you do crossword puzzles and things like that, it may help. Well, yes, there are certain things that help on a statistical level, and we don't know why they help. One is exercise. That's right. If you exercise, you can slow down the progression of Alzheimer's disease. Also, a good diet. You get the idea. Lots of fruits and vegetables and not so much animal fat. A good diet is also a way to defend yourself against Alzheimer's. Also, your social networks. New stimuli coming from interactions with different peoples. The wider the circle of friends that you have, the more new interactions you have, the more neural circuits are created, and that seems to help a little bit. But is there a cure? At the present time, there is not. However, that's where we need a science budget, because we have many promising leads, and it would be a shame if one of these promising leads never went to fruition because of a budget cut. And speaking about budgets, President Donald Trump is looking at NASA's budget. Specifically, maybe he wants a space spectacular during his first term that is going back to the moon after a 45-year hiatus, maybe even on to Mars in a hypothetical second term of President Donald Trump. Well, who knows for sure, but I get a lot of emails about Mars now, and some people say, well, is it worth it? I mean, what are we going to get for numero uno? What are we going to get as a benefit? Well, if you take a look at the moon program of the 1960s, did we bring back moon rock? Yes, but did we mine the moon for valuable minerals? Was it economically justified in that sense? And the answer is no. We still cannot mine the moon. In fact, we now know that the moon is basically made out of roughly the same materials as the Earth, because the moon was blown out of the Earth roughly 4.1 billion years ago. And as a consequence, why bother to mine the moon when you can simply mine your own backyard and save a ton of money in the process? Well, all that's true. However, to be fair, we should also point out that the space program gave us the computer revolution. You see, our astronauts are tiny people. Ever see our astronauts close up? They're remarkably small because they had to fit inside the Mercury and the Apollo space capsule, and the same thing with transistors. We had to remove the vacuum tube generation of transistors and substitute microchips. That push to miniaturize electronics helped to drive Moore's Law, which says the computer power doubles every 18 months. And you can see, therefore, that much of the stimulus for the computer revolution came from the space program. And so we know not only much more about the universe because of the space program, we also have a direct economic benefit from it because it helped to jumpstart the current revolution there. Well, another question I get is, well, who's going to pay for a mission to Mars? How much is it going to cost? Well, in the early days, the days of the first President George Bush, the estimate was $400 to $500 billion. I still remember when Vice President Dan Quayle came out and gave an estimate for a mission to Mars, $400 to $500 billion. And at that point, it was dead in the water. Who's going to pay $400 to $500 billion to go to Mars when there's no immediate economic benefit going to Mars? So it was dead in the water. But now there's some game changers. First of all, private enterprise is the wild card. Elon Musk of PayPal, Tesla Motors, and SpaceX is talking about perhaps funding a moon mission and maybe even a Mars mission by himself, or with government cooperation. Same thing with Jeff Bezos, the brains behind Amazon and the Washington Post. He wants to go to the moon, and he also wants to go to Mars. So there's that wild card that perhaps taxpayers' money will not be the only source of funds, but billionaires' deep pockets may help to defray the cost of going to Mars. And why go to Mars? Economically, there's no reason for going to Mars in the short term. Why the rush? Because of ego and competition. However, in the long term, I had Carl Sagan on my airwaves, and Carl Sagan was very blunt. There's no need for a rush to go to Mars, but in the long term, on a scale of centuries to millennia, we have to leave the planet. It's practically a law of physics that one day the Earth will be destroyed, either through meteor impacts, ice ages, volcanic eruptions, maybe global warming, another ice age, and even the death of the sun itself. It's inevitable that we must become a two-planet or a multi-planet species. So from that point of view, he argued that we should go to Mars. But if you look at Mars, Mars is a barren planet. It's sub-freezing for the most time. Atmospheric pressure is 1% that of what we see on the planet Earth. You choke trying to breathe a carbon dioxide atmosphere, and it's awfully cold there, and it holds a lot of radiation from the sun and out of space. So what would it take to convert it into a Garden of Eden? Well, you would have to terraform the planet, make it Earth-like. You would have to raise the planet's temperature by about 6 degrees. If you do the math, and you raise the temperature of Mars by 6 degrees, then the polar ice caps begin to melt. Water vapor is then put into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide also goes into the atmosphere, and they, of course, are greenhouse gases. Water vapor, methane, carbon dioxide, because of the rising temperature of Mars, would go into the atmosphere, creating an even warmer planet. So you now have a vicious spiral where temperatures begin to rise. The more the temperature rises, the more the polar ice caps melt, and the more the polar ice caps melt, the more carbon dioxide, oxygen, and water vapor you have in the atmosphere. And that could set into motion the terraforming of Mars. But hey, how long would it take? Perhaps centuries. And lastly, I'd like to say a few things about predictions that fail. You know, we scientists sometimes like to make predictions, but not the kind of predictions that the average person makes. For example, many people, when they think about the future, the first thing they say is, well, where's my flying car? Where's my jetpack that you guys predicted? Where's my vacation on Venus? I mean, why can't you scientists ever make correct predictions? Well, first of all, we scientists never predicted that we're going to have jetpacks and flying cars and vacations on Venus. That comes from a cartoon. And unfortunately, most people's ideas about the future come from cartoons and popular literature, not from scientists. So let's take them one at a time. First of all, jetpacks. Yes, we scientists can make jetpacks. In fact, during World War II, the Nazis used hydrogen peroxide to create a jetpack. However, the problem with jetpacks is the portable power pack. They don't last very long. A jetpack only lasts for a few minutes, and then you run out of hydrogen peroxide fuel, and then you fall to the planet Earth. So the problem with ray guns and the problem with jetpacks is a portable power source. That's why we don't have ray guns. And that's why we don't have jetpacks. For example, we scientists can make a ray gun that is as powerful as the ray gun you see in Buck Rogers, but you have to have a nuclear power plant behind you in order to energize it. And that's, of course, impractical. And so that's one of the reasons why we don't have jetpacks and ray guns. But what about flying cars? Actually, this year, the first flying cars became commercially available. But they are very expensive, on the order of a few $100,000 per flying car, not to mention the fact that they are gas guzzlers. But that doesn't prevent Uber from making plans for the first commercial flying car. So imagine a driverless a flying car, compliments of Uber. Well, another prediction that people sometimes make is the paperless office, which, of course, never came to be. In fact, we have more paper today than we did at the beginning of the computer era. And so some people say, yeah, you see, you scientists get it all wrong. We do not have the paperless office or the peopleless city. Some people thought that we would teleconference and not commute to work. As a consequence, cities would empty out, no more traffic jams as people worked at home via teleconferencing. Well, as you can imagine, today we have megacities, more commuting than ever before. So why were all these predictions wrong? Well, these predictions are wrong not because scientists didn't project far into the future. Yes, we can have all these wondrous kinds of technologies because of Moore's law, the fact that computer power doubles every 18 months. But the problem is humans. You see, we humans, personality-wise, haven't changed much for about 100,000 years since we emerged from Africa. Our emotions, our feelings, our jealousies, our angers are pretty much the same as they were 100,000 years ago. We're still the hunter. We're still the caveman, the cave women of old. And what did cavemen and cave women do in those days? Well, they hunted. They had to prepare the food. But in addition, you had to have proof of the kill. You can't simply boast that you had that buffalo or the deer inside the sights of your bow and arrow. You want proof that you got that deer. So we want proof of the kill. And that's why we want paper. That's what paper is, hard copy, proof of the kill. We don't trust those electrons that dance on our computer screen that disappear like magic when you hit the off button. No, we want hard copy. We want proof. And that's why we have paper in our office today. And what about the peopleless city? Well, because we are hunters, we like to bond with other hunters. And as a consequence, bonding is very important to forge relationships. And that's why in the head office, you want to have people that are very close to you, that you can bond with, that you can read their body language up close. You can't read body language on a computer screen very closely at all. And for example, if you're the boss in a company, you know that sometimes your employees lie to you. And you want to see them squirm. You want to ask embarrassing questions to make them uncomfortable and see how they react. You can't do that on a computer screen. You have to do that up close. And that's the reason why the prediction was wrong. We still have cities, we still have commuting, we still have bonding. We are in some sense still the cavemen and cave women of 100,000 years ago with our cities. Well, I'm afraid that's it for the first part of exploration. In the second part of exploration, we're going to continue our discussion of wealth generation and technology. By cutting the science budget, you are essentially killing the goose that laid the golden egg. And in the second part of exploration, we'll talk about one of the greatest sources of inventive genius, Thomas Edison. So in the second half of exploration, we'll talk about the life of Thomas Edison. Welcome. Once again, this is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And this is the second half of exploration. In the first half of exploration, we mentioned the fact that budget cuts proposed by the new budget of President Donald Trump, has science and medicine being drastically cut back. And my personal opinion is that you're killing the goose that laid the golden egg. Because what is the source of wealth, prosperity, jobs? Going all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, and then the Electric Revolution, and then the Computer Revolution, we see that science has generated enormous benefits and wealth and prosperity and jobs. And by cutting back on these things, you're basically cutting back. By consuming the seed corn, you are making it impossible for the next generation to benefit from the discoveries coming from our laboratories. Think of the Human Genome Project. Think of the transistor. Think of the laser. Think of the prosperity, the jobs, the wealth created by these seminal inventions which were once thought to be pure science. And that's why when we look at the history of science, you realize that Thomas Edison was a pioneer in showing how the electric age, which comes out of physics, can benefit everyone, creates consumer goods, create generators, power supplies, light bulbs, illuminate our cities, and create the electric age. So when we talk about Thomas Edison, realize that Edison was not just a creative genius. He was the one who helped to harness the power of electricity and magnetism to create wealth, prosperity, and jobs. And by cutting back on the science budget, you are in some sense consuming the goose that laid the golden egg. Instead of creating jobs, you're actually destroying jobs. So think about that when we interview Randall Strauss and we talk about a biography of Thomas Edison. And now I'd like to introduce our special guest for today. He's Randall Strauss, a columnist for the New York Times, and he's written a delightful new book called The Wizard of Menlo Park, how Thomas Alva Edison invented the modern world. That's right, invented the modern world. We're talking about the man who invented the phonograph, invented the light bulb, invented the motion picture industry, invented the electric power grid, and most of what we today take for granted as the modern world. And the question is, what was the secret of his success? And if you are an entrepreneur, especially in Silicon Valley, what kinds of traits can you learn? What kind of tips can you learn by studying the life and the mistakes of the Wizard of Menlo Park? So once again, our special guest today is Randall Strauss. The book is called The Wizard of Menlo Park, and he's a columnist for the New York Times. The first question for you is, how did you get interested in writing a biography of this iconic figure, Thomas Edison?
About 10 years ago, I wrote a biography of Steve Jobs. I was looking at Jobs' attempt to found a second company after Apple, and he was a big fan of Edison. And in the course of doing research for that book, I kept running into Edison's name, and then the book that followed that, which was about Bill Gates and Microsoft, again, I ran into Mr. Edison. I think it's fair to say that anyone working in the high-tech industry today owes a lot to Edison, and many people feel that connection, that debt to the inventor's contributions that set up the infrastructure and also set up a model of the inventor/business person, the tech-savvy entrepreneur.
And also
he served as an inspirational example for today's successful entrepreneurs. Yeah?
Okay. And, well, let's talk about his early years. Of course, he wasn't born rich. He didn't have scientists, professors as parents, and yet he's a self-made man that changed the world. So what about his early years?
He received virtually no formal schooling. He was homeschooled for a few years by his mother, but not for very long. And was selling fruit and snacks on a train as a very young boy. And he was self-taught. And I think one reason we have long been curious about his earliest years is because he was really the last, you might say, the last prominent figure in a technical field who could get away with absolutely no formal schooling. In a way, he was an exception then, and he has remained a curious figure. It's as if the more formal training that is needed in a given scientific or technical field, the more interesting the Edison counterexample is.
I guess he shares some similarity with a Michael Faraday of England, who was also self-taught, born into poverty, was a bookbinder, and became one of the greatest scientists of the 1800s. So I guess there's some similarity there, except that Michael Faraday is on, I think, the 5-pound note. He's on the British money, but Edison is not on our money.
He is not. It's interesting. He had 6 children, and 2 of them went to MIT. One did not complete his degree, but his very youngest son, Theodore, did complete his degree and actually did some graduate work. And it's interesting, the contrast between the formal training that the father received compared with his youngest son. So in the course of 2 generations, we see a change, a very dramatic change in what is necessary for being educationally equipped to create new things.
Okay, well, let's talk about his first great invention, which we take for granted. But if you could tell us a little bit about the shock that people felt when Edison invented the phonograph.
It did come as a shock, and we've lost that sense of awe that was present when the very first witnesses to this miracle heard it for the first time. Part of the shock was the physical dimensions. It was a small device. Essentially, it was a cylinder that was mounted with a crank, and a sheet of tinfoil was wrapped around it, and a stylus was placed on top, and the stylus was connected to a very, very crude device, essentially a microphone. And at the time, others had tried to recreate human speech by means of building machines that were closer to a pipe organ than anything else. They were large, they involved bellows, and here was this device that fit literally on a tabletop. There was not much to it, and that it could faithfully reproduce any human sound in any language. That was also very impressive to those early observers. Was something that no one before its invention literally had even conceived of, let alone imagined it would be possible to build.
Now, in your book, you detail how shocking it was, headlines stating that you could finally hear the voices of dead people. You could record the voices of your father, your mother, Caruso, great politicians, and actually hear their voices after they're dead. That was stunning, right?
The idea was stunning, but let's remember there were no voices to be played initially. And in fact, that early demonstration phonograph was not really a practical machine. I mentioned it took you would wrap a sheet of tinfoil around it. What those witnesses who spoke excitedly about being able to hear dead poets in the future didn't realize was that once you took that sheet of foil off the machine, you could not put it back on and play. And all the demonstrations of the phonograph those early years involved Edison or his assistant recording and then instantly playing without touching that tin foil. And it would only be when he develops, he and his competitors, first a wax cylinder and then a disc, was the recording medium sufficiently durable to permit a separation of recording and playback.
Okay, now we'll talk about fame a little bit later because he becomes increasingly famous over the decades. But what was the reaction to this machine and the reaction of this man who performs this miracle of recording the human voice for the first time?
Well, part of the surprise was that the inventor was a young man. He was 30 years old. And he very shrewdly decided to unveil his machine in the offices of Scientific American. He takes the machine into the office, puts it on the table, and he has pre-recorded a self-introduction. So the phonograph says to the gathered editors, "Hello, I'm the phonograph." And it was stunning. And Scientific American literally stopped the presses. They had an issue that was in production at the time. The editors decided on the spot to hold that issue and insert notice of this wondrous invention. And that moment made Thomas Edison famous. When the phonograph is announced with the imprimatur of the Scientific American's editors behind it, it had instant credibility, and he became famous at that moment and would learn that once you achieve the kind of fame he was given, he could never become anything but the famous person. He couldn't turn off the fame. He could never become unfamous.
What do you mean by that? People chasing him for autographs or spying on him and looking at his garbage? Or what do you mean by that?
Well, he did not face quite the intrusiveness that celebrities today face, but it was pretty close. The world, first of all, when it becomes aware of his lab in what was then rural, suburban New Jersey, becomes aware of his laboratory, they descend upon it, and they think nothing of interrupting his work. And there's a time when he was unable to get much of anything done because visitors would come in and demand that he play for them a demonstration song, and the song that Edison was condemned to repeat again and again and again was Mary Had a Little Lamb. This was the price of fame. Fame got him a contract with investors to establish a company that was going to commercialize the phonograph, but fame at the same time brought a torrent of visitors, a torrent of mail. The mail would include a category of requests that he termed begging letters. Strangers would write him saying, "I need money," something I think famous people today would recognize as a phenomenon that persists today.
In fact, if you win the lottery, that's the first thing that happens, right? You get deluged by people who have their hands out.
And what I find is very interesting in looking at Edison's acquaintance with fame and the price it exacts is how the public has no compunction about respecting the privacy of the other person. Just incredible demands are made upon Edison, and at first he doesn't realize how big a burden it's going to be for him, for his family, and his children are going to always live in his shadow. So they're going to pay a price too.
Okay. Well, let's move on because Edison tops this. Not only is he now world-renowned, he goes on to invent the light bulb and the motion picture industry. So could you walk us through his succeeding inventions?
The phonograph comes when he's 30, and by the time he's 35, he's going to have announced that he's solved the problem of what was then called subdividing light, that is, coming up with a workable incandescent light bulb. At the time, arc lighting was dominating cities and was too bright for indoor use. He's going to announce he's invented it before he has. Then he's going to scramble to come up with solutions to problems he ran into in the course of trying to come up with the incandescent light bulb. Mm-hmm. Then he's going to form a company, land permission to build the first central power station that supplies indoor lighting system in Lower Manhattan.
That was on Pearl Street, right?
On Pearl Street, right. Mm-hmm. And he's going to succeed. When he turns the switch, it works. He's going to do all of this. So from phonograph to successful build-out of the first municipal incandescent lighting system and accompanying power infrastructure.
Okay,
now do all this in 5 years. Amazing.
Now, when I was a kid, I read a biography of Thomas Edison, and there's a famous story of how he would experiment with literally hundreds of different kinds of substances that would incondense in a light bulb to create the light bulb. And that became legendary. And there's that famous quotation that genius is, 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. How much of that story is true?
Well, let's start with that famous quote. It turns out I could find no documented evidence that he ever said that. If you track down the source that was used by earlier biographers, it turns out it's a phrase used by someone who claimed acquaintance with Edison, who was speaking it several decades after he claimed he had heard Edison use the phrase. But there's no, certainly there's no document in Edison's own hand where he uses this.
Now, what about the story, though? The story, though, that he went through hundreds of substances before he finally got it right.
The story is true. They did go, and I'm using the plural, they. It was he and his assistants. And part of the problem with the myth of the lone, inspired, hardworking inventor, the outsized image of Edison, the inventor, was he always, from very early on, even before, of course, the invention of the phonograph, he had a team of assistants. So it wasn't Edison alone. It was the assistants who were running through long lists of all kinds of materials to see what would serve well, what would last as a suitable filament. They had a lot of fun with this, too, just trying outlandish materials to see what would work. And it would be a strip of bamboo that would turn out to be the basis for the first generation of really workable incandescent bulbs. The other thing about this story that I think is interesting to look back on was how it was not informed by scientific theory. At the time, it was termed cut and try. That is, just try everything. Today, we would more colloquially say throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks. And that really was the technique. And, of course, this approach, this methodology, if I can dignify it with the term methodology, it's really the absence of a methodology, is not going to be a serviceable model for the institutionalization of invention that's going to follow Edison's career. He's going to be the one who makes this an appealing kind of storybook approach to invention, but it's not an approach that corporations are going to copy as they institutionalize invention.
Okay, let me ask you about a famous story about Edison. He was suspicious of people with fancy degrees from colleges. He was going to hire, according to the story, this one PhD, and he asked him to calculate the volume inside a light bulb. Okay, so this PhD candidate got out and used calculus, and after many, many hours came out with a number that approximated the volume inside a light bulb. And then Edison simply got the light bulb, put it under a faucet, put water in the faucet, and then simply weighed the water and got the calculation within a matter of seconds, just to prove that you don't need so much book learning. Is that really true?
It's a true story. I saw several different accounts of it. It involved actually an employee of his, and you have to feel sorry for the PhD who was hired for his training, but was subject to really what were cruel pranks. Edison felt so ambivalent about those who had received, who had graduate degrees, who had received advanced training. He couldn't resist looking for opportunities to humiliate his most highly trained staff. And that's a great example of this ambivalence.
Okay, now tell us a little about the motion picture industry.
Motion pictures are going to be a passion of his. He works on a camera that is going to advance the field. He's going to buy the rights to use a projecting system that really makes possible the ability of audiences to see motion pictures on a screen. He was not able to invent that himself, and he and his advisors were willing to acquire the technology and market it under his name. He understood that he had acquired a reputation that had commercial value, and just the association of his name made this technology viable. It was an incredibly competitive marketplace. There were a number of competing projection systems that were all jostling with one another. He was also involved in the production of movies. He had a movie studio, and under his name, a number of very important early movies, very short movies, were made until he did eventually leave the business. He, in movies as in recorded sound, enjoyed the privilege of making artistic decisions about what would get produced, what kind of movies, what kind of musicians would receive his support. And so we have the case of an inventor wielding power into in the artistic realm, and he enjoyed that role very much.
Okay, let me ask you the key question then. What was the secret of his genius? Was it that he was born that way? Was it that he simply tried everything under the sun until he got it right? What was the secret of his genius that, of course, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs today try to emulate?
He's certainly a serial entrepreneur, and he was very gifted with in a technical sense of being able to identify the crux of a technical problem, being able to guide his assistants in the search for a solution. And in our memory of the Edison legend, just as is the case today in Silicon Valley, we do remember the successes, and we are inclined to forget the failures. Steve Jobs is a great example. I mentioned I'd written a book about his career when he started this second company. I would imagine most people certainly know of his recent successes as well as his early successes, but probably don't remember there was this interval of about 10 years where he tried to start and failed in making a new company that offered a workstation, high-end computer for a academic market. And so, too, in the case of Edison's career, there are times when he tries something and fails utterly. The most dramatic example was when he left the electric light power business and basically liquidated his stock that he received in the creation of what's going to become General Electric, and puts virtually all of his money into iron ore mining in a venture that did not work out. That's part of being a serial entrepreneur. You will succeed, but not always. So I don't think that detracts from his successes. And some of his failures were glorious failures. We can talk about the electric car as what I think of as one of his glorious failures.
Well, that concludes our interview with Randall Strauss, author of a new book about Thomas Edison. And stay tuned for the second half of Exploration when we talk about the next generation of innovators. And the question is, what can we learn about the spirit of creativity, innovation that will create wealth into the future. Think of the enormous wealth generated by the light bulb and by the work of Thomas Edison. And the question is, are we up to the task? Can we create the next generation of Thomas Edisons? And Thomas Edison, in turn, depended upon the work of Faraday, Maxwell, even Benjamin Franklin, people who began to tease apart the physics and the mathematics behind electricity and magnetism. In the same way, we can foresee the coming of the fourth wave of technology. Not steam power, not electricity and magnetism, not even computers and lasers. But the fourth wave of wealth generation will be artificial intelligence and biotech and nanotech. These are going to be the drivers of wealth creation in the future. And so, yes, we're waiting for the next Thomas Edison to come along to take these disciplines and out of them create wealth. In other words, to create industries that people want, that people will pay for, that will enrich people's lives, and also employ other workers in the process. In the same way that steam power opened up the West, opened up the industrialization of society, created the working class, in the same way that electricity and magnetism and the automobile created the automobile worker and the electrical worker, in the same way that high tech has created computer programmers as well as people that are involved with intellectual capital. In the same way, we can foresee a time when the fourth wave generates a new wave of innovation, science, discovery, and, of course, wealth creation and jobs. Well, I'm afraid that's it for Exploration. Once again, our special guest today was Randall Strauss, a biographer of Thomas Edison. And we talked about where does wealth come from? What happens when you cut the science and medical budget? Good day.